Fight the good fight of the faith. Paul writes Timothy in 1 Timothy 6. And we've been talking about what does that mean? What does that look like? How do you do that? Well, we haven't really, there's no way, I'll just put it in my opinion, there's no way to fully explain what does that look like and how do you do it. But I do know this much: God has made provision for us to fight. And part of that provision comes in Ephesians chapter 6, where Paul writes about the armor. And it begins in verse 14. Stand firm then with the belt of truth buckled around your waist. That's an intentional thing, and we talked about it. The truth. It's the foundational piece of the armor. And then with the breastplate of righteousness in place. Last time we talked about this is not our righteousness. This is God's righteousness. And then in verse 15, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. Now we're going to pull that verse apart and look at it. Your feet fitted with the readiness. You know, readiness is a real, I think, underrated thing. If you're not ready, you're gonna, either you won't do or you'll probably do the wrong thing. Just that's the way life works. When I think about readiness, I think about something that I learned probably after a few years of marriage. That when my wife, who is a wonderful and dear and sweet person, I mean, she's way better than I am. She's deeper spiritually. She's more consistent. She's everything I wish I was. But when she said, even today, but way back then for sure, when she said, okay, I'm ready, I thought that meant we're making our exit. Well, no, it's kind of, what I didn't realize was I could have said, okay, hon, what are you ready for? And often it means she was ready to get ready. And a lot of times in her mind, she was just saying, okay, it won't be long. But in my mind, when I heard ready, I thought, I should go get the car. Oh, gosh. Well, and I'm told that's a fairly common thing that spouses experience. So, but ready, how do you get ready? What does it mean to be ready? I can make anything more complicated than it probably ought to be. So I'm going to try and not with this, but I do have to say, readiness, you have to make preparation. If you're going to be ready, that implies you are making preparation. For what? Well, this is readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. Now, when I was younger, and this came up in preaching and teaching, it was all about ready to share the gospel. And I think that would certainly be part of this, but I don't think that's what Paul's talking about. Because he doesn't say readiness to share the gospel, but it's readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. What comes out of the gospel of peace in a believer's life? Well, first of all, the gospel. And the word gospel, it just means good news. Now, we've come to specifically associate the first 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as the Gospels. And at times I wish that we had called them the biographies, because really they are the narrative accounts from 4 perspectives of the life and work, actions of Jesus, life teachings and actions. They embody the gospel because they describe the Jesus. Okay, now, but what is the good news? Paul talks about the gospel. I think it's in 1 Corinthians where he says Jesus came, he lived, he died, and he was raised from the dead. Those four basic facts about his story, that's where we get the good news. The good news essentially, really, you boil it all the way down and it comes to this. The good news is you do not have to go to hell. That's good news. The good news is that God has made provision for you to be saved for eternity. That is good news. That's not just, oh, well, that's nice. Oh, no. It's bigger than that. Now, the gospel of peace. It's my belief that the thing that we, as human beings, we most long for is not wealth. It's not popularity. It's not even power, but peace. And I think we substitute a lot of things for that peace that we most long for. Peace meaning security, feeling safe. And in my opinion, it comes down to not a political and exterior peace, but an internal peace. And the central peace that we long for is peace with God. We long for peace with Him. We long for peace with other people. And we long for peace with ourselves. Peace. It's the most precious. I hesitate to call it a commodity, but I don't know what else to call it. It's a thing, and it is the most precious thing for us humans. Peace. A lot of people spend much of their life pursuing substitutes for that kind of peace. And I talked about these: money, influence, power, fame, influence, whatever you go after that is a substitute for this inner peace, it doesn't get you what it promises. I mean, how many stories do we need to hear about or read of very famous people who ended their own lives because when they attained fame and fortune, it didn't give them what they most wanted: peace. The old saying about they climbed the ladder of success, and when they got to the top of the ladder, looked around and realized they'd had it against the wrong wall. It happens, but it doesn't have to. This inner peace, this deep, abiding security is possible for us, but only through the good news that Jesus has made a way for us to be okay, accepted, invited into God's family. Now, there's a lot more that could be said about that. There's probably books out there, whole books about the implications of this good news. Paul writes that your feet are fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. Now, what readiness comes out of the gospel of peace? I think of two real big parts of readiness. One is when I realize I don't have to get God's attention anymore, and I don't have to perform in a particular way for Him to like me or love me or accept me or give me the nod. When I behave poorly, he's not given me the eternal stink eye. He somehow overlooks that. Are there consequences to my bad choices? Almost always. But one of the consequences is not a break in God's constant, unconditional love for me. When I get past the idea, when I somehow replace the idea that my relationship with God is based on my performance in any way, when I replace that idea with the fact that my relationship with God is the result of His grace toward me, and that my performance doesn't change His love for me. Now, to whatever degree I'm willing to accept and receive God's grace, embracing it into my life, that's the measure of to what extent I'm going to live well within His design. Now, that's a lot of words, but it's not about my performance. Okay? A second aspect of this readiness that comes from the gospel of peace is I can have peace with myself. Nearly all the people that I've counseled struggle to one degree or another, some mightily, with forgiving themselves, accepting themselves. Self-hatred and unforgiveness of self is the root of all kinds of evil and all kinds of damage in people's lives. We harm ourselves. But this readiness that comes from the gospel of peace, when I feel at peace with God and at peace with myself, I'm ready. That sets me up to be ready to deal with whatever is coming at me, whatever God permits or wills in my life. The good and bad choices of people around me, my reaction. See, when I'm at peace with God and with myself, it frees me up to respond, not just merely react to what happens to me. Well, I could go deeply into that, but I'm not going to. I want to go back to the idea that it's your feet that are fitted with these shoes that are are the symbol of your readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. Your feet. Why your feet? Well, two things. In verse 14, the first three words, stand firm then. Stand. This is about us taking a stand against an enemy. You do that. If you don't have your feet, let's. I mean, just pragmatically, if your shoes don't fit or they're not the right kind of shoes, you're going to struggle. There's no reason to struggle. Put on the right kind of shoes. Now, the second thing is, if I'm getting my feet ready with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace, it gives me this ability to move forward with effective intention. There's a whole lot more, but the bottom line is, in my mind, this is readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. Am I embracing this, the peace that comes from the gospel and makes me ready to engage in a world of uncertainty, often confusion, and even many times inconsistency? Yeah. So my challenge is to just do an autopsy without blame. How are you doing? This is not How ready are you? No. In order to be ready, you're going to have to do these. You're going to have to focus in on the gospel of peace. Breathe deeply of God's grace today, because that's really the primary way of getting yourself ready, by returning to the gospel of peace. Blew past my time, Mark. I'll see you again next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.